Well, thank you all for finding your way here. We are doing the Gospel of Mark. This is our fifth installment this fall, if anybody's keeping score, so here we are. We are in Mark chapter 6. We've noticed that this first half of Mark has three major chunks to it, and we're just now entering the third of those chunks, in which Jesus has departed from what has been his de facto headquarters now, Capernaum. Basically, it seems to be triggered by the treatment that he was given in Nazareth. At least the way Mark tells the story, it seems that that is what now sends him off to a broader kind of audience. First of all, a broader audience in Galilee, but soon enough it's going to be outside of Galilee, outside of Israel. And so we're going to see that leading up to the Caesarea Philippi confession in chapter 8, which indeed is also outside of the bounds of Israel, and then marks the moment when he starts his trip toward Jerusalem and all of the events that really occupy the second half of Mark's gospel. The story that we have before us at this point really follows from last week's story. We saw last week Jesus sends his disciples out on their first mission, kind of a short-term mission. It's not going to go too far or take too much time. It's kind of a test run, you might say, in which the disciples are given the opportunity to try out, if you will, the powers that Jesus has given upon them. They're going to do it in a much bigger way soon enough, when he will commission them to go into all the world, but we're not quite there yet. And now we have what is one of those Markan sandwiches again. We've talked about that. The piece of bread we looked at last week. Jesus sends the disciples out. The other piece of bread, they return. And in the meantime, this meat of the sandwich seems to be unrelated, which tends to be the kind of marker of one of these, and yet we find out it's really the key to understanding the whole story. It's the account of Herod Antipas executing John the Baptist. And it stands in general for the idea that when we go out working on behalf of Christ and his cause, we can not only anticipate that God is going to be there ahead of us, as we said last week, we can rely on local hospitality, but we can also anticipate there will be resistance. The gates of hell will not withstand the onslaught of God's people, but they don't go down without a fight, you see. And in some ways, that's what this story is highlighting for us, is the idea that there's going to be pushback. And the story of John the Baptist and his execution seems to be put here by Mark to highlight that point, to drive that home for us. There's even more subtlety in this story. It's one of the very few stories in Mark in which Jesus doesn't have a role to play, only his reputation. He is not in the story. It's all preoccupied with the events surrounding John the Baptist. We have John, the good guy, and three separate personalities that are all marshaled against him. Each one, in a sense, I think you could say, stands for a different way in which the cause of Christ is resisted in this world. You've got Herod Antipas, the vacillating, spineless political leader, all about expediency. History's filled with those kind of guys, you know. You've got Herodias, his wife, the cunning, focused, almost diabolically determined strategist for getting rid of John. Then you've got Salome, the daughter, who dances. She's just kind of this self-absorbed, oblivious person who's going to give herself to the highest bidder. Really oblivious to the bigger picture, doesn't really care. She's just in it for herself. And all of church history is filled with those kinds of people. You can almost say it covers the waterfront of the kinds of folks Christian people have had to deal with in the cause of Christ, you see. Political expedience, focused, almost diabolically focused enemies, and then folks that just don't give a rip. They just are concerned about what's good for them. And so these are the players in our story. And as I say, Jesus is only there by reputation, a very rare event in the Gospel of Mark in which Jesus himself doesn't play an immediate role. So, this is Mark chapter 6. It begins at verse 14, picking up where we left last week, the Word of God. King Herod heard of it, for Jesus' name had become known. Some were saying, John the Baptist has been raised from the dead. For this reason, these powers are at work in him. But others said, it's Elijah. Others said, it's a prophet, like one of the prophets of old. When Herod heard of it, he said, John the Baptist, whom I beheaded, has been raised. For Herod himself had sent men who arrested John, bound him, and put him in prison on account of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because Herod had married her. For John had been telling Herod, it's not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. Herodias had a grudge against him and wanted to kill him, but she could not. For Herod feared John, knowing that he was a righteous and holy man, and he protected him. When he heard him, he was greatly perplexed, and yet he liked to listen to him. But an opportunity came when Herod on his birthday gave a banquet for his courtiers and officers and for the leaders of Galilee. When the daughter of Herodias came in and danced, she pleased Herod and his guests. And the king said to the girl, ask me whatever you wish, I'll give it to you. He solemnly swore, whatever you ask me, I'll give it to you, up to half my kingdom. She went out and said to her mother, what should I ask for? She replied, the head of John the Baptist. Immediately she rushed back to the king and requested, I want you to give me at once the head of John the Baptist on a platter. The king was deeply grieved. Yet out of regard for his oaths and for the guests, he did not want to refuse her. Immediately the king sent a soldier of the guard with orders to bring John's head. He went out and beheaded him in the prison, brought his head on a platter and gave it to the girl. Then the girl gave it to her mother. When his disciples heard about it, they came and took his body and laid it in a tomb. That's the end of the story, but I want to give you the other slice of bread in this sandwich. So we won't get to this week, but this will be where it kind of wraps up. The apostles gathered around Jesus, told him all that they had done and taught. You see that? The story suspended there for a while, and then it comes back, and we find the rest of it here some 15 verses later. Jesus said, come to a deserted place all by yourselves and rest for a while, for many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And that's what introduces the next story, which is the feeding of the 5,000. We'll be looking at that next week. All right, let's have a word of prayer, and we'll get going. Our Father, we're grateful for your constant mercies to us. We thank you that you've put us in a grand adventure, and that it's our rich privilege not only to have the opportunity to convey your truth to people who are receptive to it and appreciative of it, but also to, as Paul tells us, fight this battle, a warfare that is not waged with weapons of flesh and blood, to put on the armor of God, to find ourselves, in a sense, in the battlefield. And we pray that this story would give us courage and understanding of the character of that to which you've called us, asking all of these things in the name of Christ. Amen. All right, I said 3 major sections in the first half after a short preamble, getting the story going. Lessons in the authority of Jesus, decisions about the authority of Jesus. Now we are to mission with the authority of Jesus. And as I said, we looked last week at the first mission. This is really missionary effort. It's a sandwich, so we come back at the end of it when the disciples return. So at the beginning they're sent out, at the end they return, and in the meantime we have the heart of the sandwich, which is this unexpected story of the execution of John the Baptist. Mark says to us, now King Herod heard of him, of Jesus, for his name had become well known. And he said, John the Baptist is risen from the dead, and therefore these powers are at work at him. The Herod that we're referring to here is Herod Antipas, the son of Herod the Great. If you read the New Testament very much, you know that these Herods kind of pop up. You ever notice that? and it can be a little bit confusing. And because I have a pretty strong element of OCD in me, I just can't avoid now wringing the life out of this little piece of information about Herod. So my conviction is once per lifetime, every Christian should be forced to look at the family tree of Herod, and this is your lucky day. So here we go. We're going to rip through this quickly. I don't want to get preoccupied. I think about 5 minutes is what I budgeted for this, but let's go through it quickly. This is probably what Herod looked like. We have images from the first century that, at least in composite form, suggest he may have looked something like this. His first wife was a woman named Doris. Doris was probably about 20 when they married. He was about 25. They had one son. The son's name was Antipater, named in honor of Herod the Great's father, Antipater. Herod executed Antipater for allegations of treason when in the year 4 BC. So he doesn't make it into the New Testament narrative. Herod then divorces his first wife because he wants to marry into a prestige family in Israel because he's just been appointed a governor in Galilee. He marries a woman named Miriam, who is part of the de facto royalty, nobility in Israel. She's of the family that dates back to the Maccabean revolt in the 160s BC, and they're the ones that have become now kind of the upper class in Israel. The irony, of course, is that the upper class should have been people like Joseph and Mary. They are the true royalty. They descend from David. They've been pushed to the edges and have become impoverished. Now this kind of usurping quasi-nobility has taken over the upper echelons in Israel's society, and Miriam is a lovely young woman who is married by Herod the Great more or less to ingratiate himself to the Jewish people, because Herod himself is not Jewish. He's Idumean, an Edomite by Old Testament terms. And so he wants the Jewish people to like him. They have 4 kids. First, Alexandros. Alexandros is executed by Herod in 7 BC. Second, Aristobulus. Aristobulus is executed by Herod in 7 BC. That's why Augustus Caesar said, you're better off being his pig than his son. You know. However, the death of Aristobulus didn't occur until he'd had 2 kids. One is a daughter, get this, her name is Herodias. She is the Herodias in our story. The other is a young man named Agrippa. He's mentioned in the New Testament in Acts chapter 12. This is the story of Agrippa who killed James, and because he saw that it pleased the Jewish people, he arrested Peter and was going to kill him, but Peter was sprung from jail, you recall, by an angel. Remember that? Herod himself, because he would not deflect worship that was being offered to him, was struck by God, and as junior high kids love to hear, eaten by worms. And that's all in the latter part of Acts chapter 12. So that's Agrippa the first. Then we have 2 daughters, Selympsio and Cypros, and they are also part of that family. Well, then Miriam was executed on charges of infidelity. Herod the Great is a little bit like Henry VIII. He just keeps going through these wives, you know, and really, you might say Miriam was the Anne Boleyn of the story. She was probably not at all guilty of the crimes that she was alleged to have committed, but nevertheless, she's killed at 25 years old. 2 daughters. Next is another Miriam, so she's called Miriam II. She was the daughter of the Jewish high priest. She gave birth to Herod Philip. Herod Philip married his niece Herodias. And by her they had a daughter, Salome. She's the daughter that danced in the story that's before us. Herod Philip felt there was too much heat in the kitchen. He moved to Rome and sold life insurance. Well, some of that's apocryphal, you know, but anyway, he moves away. Herodias didn't like that. She wanted to be part of the royal class in Israel, not more or less obscure in Rome. But she's there with her husband, who is also her uncle, Herod Philip. All right. The next wife of Herod is named Malthace. She has 3 children by Herod. The first is a man named Archelaus. Now you may remember in the story of the Nativity, as Matthew tells it, there's one mention of Archelaus. Archelaus is the guy who took over in Judea after the death of Herod the Great. Joseph had taken the Holy Family, you recall, to Egypt, was hiding out there. On the death of Herod, he returns, but Matthew tells us when he heard that Archelaus was reigning in the place of his father, remember that? He decided not to stop off in Judea. He just went straight through and made his home in Nazareth. Archelaus himself was universally hated. He was eventually sacked by Augustus Caesar, went off into exile. That's the last we really hear about him. By the way, Judah from that point on was ruled by procurators, not kings. One of those procurators was a guy named Pontius Pilate, but he was one of a string of governors who ruled in Judea after the last king, namely Archelaus, was disposed of. The other son that's born here is Herod Antipas. This is the Herod that we hear of in the story we just read. So this is the one who had John the Baptist executed. He married Herodias. It was her second marriage. This is why it was a marriage that was condemned by John the Baptist. He had actually gone to Rome, gotten a little Twitter-pated with respect to Herodias, actually proposed to her there while she was still married to her first husband. She accepted and eventually came back to Judea because she wanted to live in the bright lights of being royalty, and so she switched husbands, you see, to go with Herod Antipas. That's what John the Baptist condemned in his sermons. A daughter was born to them as well, named Olympias. Then there was the 5th wife. Her name was Cleopatra of Jerusalem. Just to make sure your head hurts a little bit, they also had a son, Herod Philip. So there's 2 Herod Philips. That's rather confusing. I don't know why you do that, but they did. This is the Herod Philip who wound up ruling in Iturea, which is a region to the east of Galilee, contiguous border there. And so we hear of 2 Herod Philips in the New Testament, but they're not the same guy. One was the guy in Rome, one is the ruler of Iturea. They also had a son, Herod. We don't know anything about him. He probably died in childbirth. Then there were 5 more wives. I'm sure they were lovely people, but we don't care much about them. Pallas, Phaedra, Elpis, 2 that are unnamed, one a cousin, one a niece. But anyway, that accounts for all the Herods that we run into in the New Testament, with the exception of Agrippa II, the son of Agrippa I, who was the one before whom Paul appeared during his trial in about the year 60 AD. So there's the story. Well, the Herod that we have before us this morning is Herod Antipas. He was the so-called tetrarch of Galilee and Perea. You know where Galilee is. Perea is kind of an elongated piece of real estate on the east of the Jordan River. It has a contiguous border with Nabatea, which is sometimes called Arabia. It's the northern part of Arabia, really. Antipas, in order to achieve peace with the king of Nabatea, a man by the name of Aretas, married his daughter. So Herod Antipas, his first marriage is to the daughter of this neighboring king, and that's supposed to achieve a peace relationship between them based on marriage. However, 20 years later, he jilted her in order to marry Herodias. So Herodias, as you can see, divorces one uncle to marry another uncle. And that's what brings her back into the region of Israel. Now, if you really want a headache, think about this. Salome, the granddaughter of Herod the Great through her father, Herod Philip, is the great-granddaughter of Herod the Great through her mother. A little trivia, you know. If you're ever on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, that could be the million-dollar question, so you might just want to tuck that away. Well, John the Baptist, of course, publicly condemned this marriage of Antipas to his brother's wife. That's what got him arrested, because he was publicly condemning that marriage. Antipas rejected his first wife. The king in Nabatea was not pleased. And about 7 years later, he attacked Antipas, this was in the year 36, and basically wiped out his army. Antipas survived, but he was never the same. In fact, Caligula, the Roman emperor of that moment, sacked Antipas because he was such a miserable failure. That's the last we hear of Antipas. The Jewish people, as we're going to hear in a moment from Josephus, viewed this destruction of Antipas as God's judgment against him because of what he had done to John the Baptist, who was so widely respected among the Jewish people. So there's King Herod. Herod Antipas. Herod, of course, thinks maybe John the Baptist is risen from the dead. We know that in ancient Israel there were a whole lot of theories blowing around. Not every Jewish person was an Orthodox Jewish person. There were a lot of Eastern views that came in, especially Pythagoreanism and ideas of transmigration of the soul, reincarnation, and so on. And it may very well be that Herod Antipas had some of that kind of in his head as he was thinking about Jesus and these miraculous things that were happening, and maybe his guilty conscience saw in that the prospect of a haunting by this returned John the Baptist. In any event, this story is the heart of the sandwich, as I was saying. It seems to stand for the idea that faithful mission on behalf of Christ is going to pick a fight with this world. Don't be surprised, my friends, John says, if the world hates you. It's not hating you as much as it's hating the Christ who is in you, who provokes a huge amount of diabolical animosity as he pushes back the gates of hell. And sometimes we are found in the crossfire. John is seen a little bit as a foreshadowing of Jesus himself. John is, as it were, brought as a lamb to the slaughter by a corrupt and vacillating ruler. But Mark is also meaning to encourage his own audience because they also are being brought like lambs to a slaughter by Nero, who's also a corrupt and unstable ruler. And so probably as they read this story, they can see a little bit of the instruction that they're supposed to derive from the experience that John the Baptist had. Well, Herod thinks it's Jesus. Herod thinks it's John the Baptist. Others said it's Elijah. Some said it's the prophet. Elijah was a popular candidate because Elijah is one of only two people in the Old Testament that never dies. You know, Enoch walked with God and was not back in Genesis. Elijah took his sidekick Elisha out across the Jordan. Elijah went up on top of a mountain and started singing, "Swing low, sweet chariot," and down it came, and sure enough, coming for to carry me home, and it went home, you see. And the Jewish people had an idea that Elijah was just up there somewhere, kind of in outer space, orbiting, and that one of these days he would come back. And that was actually reinforced by the prophet Malachi, who in the very last paragraph of his prophecy, which is the last paragraph of the Old Testament, said, "Before the great and awesome day of the Lord, Elijah will return." And so there was kind of a highly developed expectation that, Elijah might show up. And so here's Jesus. Maybe he's Elijah. Maybe he is the prophet. You know that in the book of Deuteronomy, Moses had predicted that someday one would come who would be a prophet like Moses, but greater. The text in Deuteronomy reads, "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your midst, from your brethren. Him you shall hear according to all you desired of the Lord your God in Horeb in the day of the assembly, saying, Let me not hear again the voice of the Lord my God, nor let me see this great fire anymore, lest I die. And the Lord said to me, What they've said is good. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brethren, and I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him. And it shall be that whoever will not hear my words, which he speaks in my name, I will require it of him." This has been seen really ultimately as a prediction of the coming of Messiah. So in some ways, people that said this is the prophet were right. Jesus was certainly more than a prophet, but not less than a prophet, and probably was the fulfillment of that expectation. Others said he's just one of the prophets. The prophet Haggai in the Old Testament had said a time would come, this is in chapter 2, when God would shake the nations. We're coming up on Messiah, not long. I always love it when John Frankhauser stands up in the sanctuary and shakes the sanctuary. The shaking of the nations. It's wonderful. It's a text from Haggai. The people of Israel believed that someday God would shake the nations, and they thought he would do that by unleashing many prophets. And so some thought, well, maybe this is the harbinger of these many prophets who are going to come and shake the nation. So all kinds of people trying to put Jesus in some sort of category, some kind of box. None quite fit, but you can see how all of their imaginations were spinning. Well, Herod insisted, this is John, whom I beheaded. He's been raised from the dead. He heard about Jesus, about his miracles, believed that John had probably returned to haunt him. There's been lore that's gone back thousands of years that if someone dies a violent and unjust death that is not cared for by human institutions of justice, that person will come back and haunt you. That's not biblical teaching, but it has been a popular idea, and even Herod was wondering if this was John the Baptist coming back to haunt him because of the vicious murder that he'd committed against John. We know that by the time of the trial of Jesus, Herod had more or less left behind his anxieties. Jesus was probably tried about a year later. Pontius Pilate shuffled Jesus off to Herod when he heard that Jesus was from Galilee, and Herod, of course, had jurisdiction in Galilee, and Pontius Pilate's just trying to get rid of a problem. So he says, oh, good, you're from Galilee, go see Herod, And in that confrontation with Herod, Herod just wants to see some magic tricks. He's heard Jesus can do magic. He wants to see some. I'm not a great fan of the musical Jesus Christ Superstar, but I do think they captured Herod Antipas pretty well in that one line when Herod says to Jesus, show the world that you're no fool, walk across my swimming pool, That's kind of what Herod wanted. He wanted to see some show, some rabbits coming out of a hat. Jesus didn't oblige him. Jesus winds up back with Pontius Pilate before it's all done. Well, Herod himself, Mark tells us, had sent and laid hold of John and bound him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, for he had married her. The prison in which Herod bound John the Baptist was Machaerus. Machaerus was a fortress built at that border between Perea and Nabatea. The fortress had actually been built by Herod the Great, his father. It was a defensive fortress. It was for Herod's protection against any anticipated invasion by the Nabateans, and so it was there, and it was occupied by Herod's own military rule. You can visit to this day. You can take a selfie right there if you want to at the remains of that palace that are still erected there. Well, when Herod the Great died, control of that fortress passed to his son, Herod Antipas. Herod Antipas would rather make love than war, if you're old enough to remember that great line. And so he decided to marry the King Aretas of Nabatea rather than kind of doing all this saber rattling as his dad had done in that fortress. So the marriage is formulated, and that's the first marriage. However, 20 years later, as we were saying earlier, Herod is traveling through Rome. He proposes to Herodias, his niece, and the wife of his half-brother. She accepts on the condition that Herod Antipas banish his first wife, which he does, and she escapes then exile by fleeing back to Nabatea to the court of her father, and as I was saying earlier, he is not happy. And some years later, he actually attacks Antipas in retaliation for this snub of his family and especially of his daughter. The historian Josephus, Flavius Josephus, tells us that the destruction of Antipas at the hands of Aretas was viewed by Jewish people commonly as a judgment from God because of what he had done to John the Baptist. Josephus says, quote, "Now some of the Jews thought that the destruction of Herod's army came from God, as a just punishment of what Herod had done against John, who was called the Baptist. For Herod had killed this good man who had commanded the Jews to exercise virtue, righteousness towards one another, piety towards God. Many people came in crowds to John the Baptist, for they were greatly moved by his words. Herod, who feared that the great influence John had over the masses might put them into his power and enable them to raise a rebellion, for they seemed ready to do anything he should advise, thought it best to put him to death. In this way, he might prevent any mischief John might cause and not bring himself into difficulties by sparing a man who might make him repent of it when it was too late. Accordingly, John was sent as a prisoner out of Herod's suspicious temper to Machaerus, the castle I already mentioned, and was put to death. Now the Jews thought the destruction of his army was sent as a punishment from Herod and a mark of God's displeasure with him. All right, that's Josephus' account. Josephus, the Jewish historian, has no interest in the biblical account or defending Christianity at all. He's just writing as a detached Jewish historian. And you'll notice a difference, don't you? There's a little difference in the account of these two. I think the best way to think about that is that, number one, those stories are actually compatible. Josephus is much more interested in the political background of what's going on, and that's his focus, whereas Mark, of course, is much more interested in what you might call the moral dynamics of the story, and especially these three characters that I mentioned earlier. Antipas, enemy number one, vacillating, spineless, political expedient, subject to flattery, just, that kind of guy. The Christian movement has had to deal with that kind of political opposition down through history. Just folks that are too sort of wishy-washy to be worth much either way, but they just create problems. Then you've got the more determined enemies. Herodias, cunning, scheming, she's smart, she wants John out of the way, and if she can't do it up front, then she's going to do it by some kind of subterfuge, and she's the one probably who has the greatest malice, it seems, in the story. And then you got Salome, who almost comes off like a prostitute. She'll just sell herself to the highest bidder. She's absorbed in her own interests. She really doesn't care about John the Baptist or anyone else. She cares about her own lot in life, and so that's the way that she approaches it. And these three sort of cover the waterfront of the way the Christian faith has had to navigate resistance down through history. So anyway, maybe Mark is giving us something like that. John had said to Herod, "It is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife." This is in the imperfect tense, could be rendered, John kept saying to Herod. This wasn't just one passing remark in one sermon, This was John constantly coming back and beating the drum again and again. It's not lawful for you to have this woman as your wife. Jesus had said of John the Baptist, "Among those born of women, there has never arisen greater than John the Baptist." And at least I think part of that great tribute he gives is the courage that John himself must have been exercising to take these kinds of public stands against the power that was ruling in that time. Certainly, some of the greatest moments in Christian history have turned on people similarly rising in great courage to condemn public corruption, sometimes political corruption, sometimes ecclesiastical corruption, but down through history we see that. In any event, John said it's not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. The Old Testament background for this is that Moses forbid a man to marry his brother's wife. That is, for her to divorce one husband and marry another one. And so that was the backdrop. The exception was if the brother died, then the living brother could marry that widow and raise up, in the name of the deceased brother, children who would carry on the family name. And so in that kind of patriarchal society, that was the rule that applied. That was, of course, the backstory of the story of Ruth in the Old Testament, as you probably know. Well, here, of course, none of those rules applied. The brother hadn't died. They already had a child. There was no legitimacy in this marriage whatsoever. Herodias held it against him and wanted to kill him, but she could not. She had come back to Galilee wanting to be the queen. She wanted to have the good life. She wanted to be esteemed in the public eye. You know, she wanted to have that kind of upper crest experience of being royalty, and this was her best chance to do it, and that's why she'd married Antipas, was because she wanted to have that kind of benefit. And now all of a sudden you've got this noise ruining everything. John the Baptist publicly condemning this marriage and raising public ire against her, and she's losing everything that she thought she was going to enjoy. And that arouses in her what seems like a much more deep and bitter kind of animosity. It is the case, I think you know, that when you engage in moral reproof of people in power, the response is more likely to be bullying than it is to be self-examination and repentance. I'm going to avoid saying anything about the current public election cycle, but you probably can think of examples of that. Moral reformers down through history have wound up discussing their grievances more likely at a stake than at a table. To wit, John Huss, burned at the stake, Council of Constance, 1415. Girolamo Savonarola, you know, the great moral reformer in Florence at the height of the Renaissance, similar fate. William Tyndale, the brilliant linguist, translator of the New Testament into English, critic of the reigning powers in England, burned at the stake for his efforts, and how many others in history who've had the courage to rise up and challenge public corruption and wound up being bullied into some kind of consequence like that. Well, Herodias couldn't do anything directly about John the Baptist. She was paralyzed, at least in terms of an overt action against him, but she was not above scheming some more subtle approaches. The reason she couldn't do anything was because Herod feared John. Knowing he was a just and holy man, he protected him, and when he heard him, he did many things and heard him gladly. It's one of the oddest verses in the Bible, isn't it? Just think about it. Read it. He feared John. He knew he was just and holy. He protected him. When he heard him, he did many things, and he heard him gladly. All right. Well, Herod feared John. There's something dreadful about a truly holy person, you know. Solomon tells us the righteous are as bold as a lion. He also says the wicked show a bold face, but flee when no man pursues. Mary, Queen of Scots, had an ongoing conflict with the founder of the Presbyterian Church in Scotland named John Knox. Mary, Queen of Scots, was terrified of John Knox. All he had was a Bible and a pulpit. That's all. And yet she's reported to have said repeatedly she feared his sermons more than she feared any army or navy in the world. That's how much clout was exercised by this one guy. And actually, John Knox stood about this tall and weighed 100 pounds. You know, just a little. And yet the power that he exercised there. Well, Herod protected John. Some think maybe he was being gradually won over. Maybe the sermons of John were actually getting to him. And if that's the case, Herodias saw her position imperiled. In any event, we hear when Herod heard him, one, he did many things. This is the Greek word apore. This is half of your Greek lesson now. This is from the Greek word paruomai, which means to go. It is, however, the negation of the word apore, to not go, but it implies the attempt to go, and out of it derives the notion of just wringing your hands, trying to do the, not going which way to go. What do you do? You're in this state of kind of perplexed anxiety. The lexicon is wonderful. In perplexity, without resources, in straits, left wanting, embarrassed, in doubt, don't know which way to turn. You ever felt that way? That's how Herod Antipas felt in the face of the preaching of John the Baptist. He feared him. He wasn't sure he liked it very much. He wanted to do something, but you know what? He's in this state of just anxious perplexity. Something like Felix with respect to his prisoner, the Apostle Paul. Something like England during the Great Awakening under the preaching of John Wesley, who published a book entitled Thoughts About Slavery that embarrassed the nation to its core because of the widespread slaving operations that were going on around the world. And they thought themselves kind of polite folks, and yet he exposed the ghastly, horrid trade, as he called it, of slaving operations. He exposed in the Industrial Revolution the exploitation of women and children in the mills and the factories and the mines in England. It was all invisible to polite society. And he ripped the mask off of it and left people in a state of perplexity and anxiety and wringing their hands. William Carey did the same thing with the British East India Company when he went to India and found the opportunistic exploitation of the people there who were serving the needs of polite British folks but living in the most unhappy circumstances, more or less under their exploitation. In the 20th century, both Karl Barth and Dietrich Bonhoeffer did the same thing to Europe as they were exposing what was happening in Nazi Germany. And people were perplexed, but they just didn't know what to do about it. I think in America today, we're dealing with something like that. The national disgrace of 60 million abortions since 1973. And a lot of people are wringing their hands, but what do we do about it, you see? And so Herod is kind of in that state of being just tied up in knots. But at the same time, the text says strangely, he heard him gladly. This is the word heidetos. It's the word from which we get the word hedonism. It is an idea of pleasure, but you know the word hedonism doesn't imply deep, rich, joyful pleasure, but kind of a strange, superficial pleasure, right? A hedonic pleasure, that kind of thing. Just between you and me, I don't like roller coasters, you know. I don't know why people ride them. My wife, now don't tell her I mentioned this to you, talked me into getting on some roller coaster. What was that thing called? The Screamer. I only did it because I love her, but it did test me, you know. It's awful, but some people love to be terrified. You know that? Some people go to scary movies because they find a strange pleasure in being scared out of their wits. And that's what this word implies. When Herod heard John preach, it was like going to the worst scary movie you can imagine. His hair stood on end. It was this feeling of a kind of pleasure that comes from just being absolutely horrified and terrified. And so he's perplexed. He doesn't know which way to turn. He's in a state of anxiety, and yet he heard him with pleasure. What a strange package. This is Herod, you know. Well, the same word is used, by the way, later by Mark when he says, the common people heard Jesus gladly. Again, not implying heartfelt faith, but rather just kind of the glad hearing of someone who's kind of giving you something exciting. Jesus' messages about judgment that would come, not one stone would be left upon another, that kind of thing, terrifying them. Paul uses that word. You put up with fools gladly, for you're so wise, he says, dripping with sarcasm. But the gladly there is, again, this kind of hedonistic pleasure. When an opportune day came, Herod on his birthday gave a feast for his nobles, the high officers and the chief men of Galilee. And when Herodias' daughter herself came in and danced, she pleased Herod and those who sat with him. The king said to the girl, ask me whatever you want, I'll give it to you. Josephus, by the way, says that in the elite, very wealthy class in Israel, dancing women were common. Seductive dancing. This was part of the culture in the elite class in Israel. So what Mark reports here is not the least bit inconsistent. It may have been a surprise to Antipas when it was his own stepdaughter who came in to do this dance, but nevertheless, that's not totally out of the world of possibility. Antipas was undoubtedly arised at what we might call a puerile level, you know. He was not a man noted for his moral discipline or integrity, and he gives himself to this entertainment, as does everybody who's there. There was one commentator who said, "People will sell their souls in a sorry bargain. As the old adage, the trouble with money is that it costs so much." Well, as this dancing entertainment is finished, he, in a kind of sweeping, more or less over-the-top promises, "Whatever you ask me, I'll give it to you up to half my kingdom." Interestingly, Antipas could not make that offer. He served at the pleasure of Rome. He couldn't give away any of his kingdom without Roman permission. So the offer he makes here was kind of an empty one at that. And so whatever else it represented, it wasn't something that he actually could have made good on. She went out and asked her mother, "What shall I ask?" And she said, "Ask for the head of John the Baptist." The Apostle Paul tells us that children should obey their parents with the caveat, "in the Lord." That is to say, even a child should obey their parents, certainly in every legitimate instruction. That's part of the honoring of the parents that the New Testament and Old Testament enjoin. But if a parent commands a child to commit a criminal act, to do something that is contrary to the law of God, that child in good conscience can say, "No, no, sir," respectfully, but firmly. Not many children will do that because of the immense power that a parent can exercise over a child, but the child is certainly within their conscientious rights to do so. Well, Salome, the daughter, of course, doesn't go there. So Herodias is able to make her daughter, Salome, an accessory to murder purely to satisfy her own malice. The Old Testament says that the sins of the fathers are visited on the third and fourth generation. It doesn't say the third and fourth generation are punished for the sins of the parents. That's not what it says, although it's sometimes translated that way. It says their sins are visited upon them, meaning the paradigm established by the parent is often replicated in the child for generations to come, and the unhappy effects of that are thus visited on those as well, and certainly we have an unhappy example of that here. Immediately she came in with haste to the king and asked, saying, "I want you to give me the head of John the Baptist on a platter." It seems she added that little detail. She wanted the platter. Her mother hadn't said that. The king was exceedingly sorry, yet because of the oaths and because of those who sat with him, he did not want to refuse her. One commentator said he made the vow with merry abandonment, regretted it with anxious dread, adding, "How many stupid things have been done because of oaths and the need for face saving, and guests, that is, playing to the gallery." And of course, Herod walked right into that one. Immediately the king sent an executioner, commanded his head to be brought, and he went and beheaded him in prison. The executioner was the speculator, from which we get the word spectator. It was actually technically in the ancient world a watcher, and from that derived the idea of a bodyguard. It was Herod's personal and most intimate, devoted, and more or less ruthless defenders. They just did without question whatever he asked. They were assassins. That was their primary function. So they were only really quasi-military, but they had that kind of bodyguard status, and that's who he sent to do this. Someone who doesn't ask questions, does as commanded, and that's exactly what happens. He brought his head on a platter, gave it to the girl. The girl gave it to her mother. When his disciples heard of it, they came and took away his corpse and laid it in a tomb. The translator of the Vulgate Bible, Jerome, writing in the 3rd and 4th centuries on this text, says the following. This is based on historical sources available to him. He says the following, quote, "When the head of the Baptist was brought, Herodias barbarously thrust the tongue through with a bodkin, as Fulvia is said to have done over and over again the tongue of Cicero, thus verifying what Cicero had once said while living, that, quote, 'Nothing is more revengeful than a woman.' Because they could not bear to hear the truth, Therefore they bored through with a bodkin the tongue that had spoken the truth. It's a very powerful quote. I don't know what you think about that part about a woman, because I think men are equally capable of that particular malicious response as well. But be that as it may, that may have in fact happened. All right, Sunday school lesson for the morning. Number 1, service in the cause of Christ will arouse hostility. We were saying last week, Jesus will be there ahead of you as you go on your Christian mission, whether around the world or around the block. You can bank on Jesus being there and preparing the way for what he has sent you to accomplish. But brace yourself, the gates of hell don't go down without a fight, you know. There is entrenched evil in this world, and it doesn't give up its turf very easily. And so as we go and serve Christ, there is predictably going to be resistance. We should just get used to the idea. It's not because we're being obnoxious, hopefully not, but it's because, as Jesus himself says, the world has hated me. There's a hostility to King Jesus taking back what is his. The strong man doesn't want to be plundered. And so as we act on his behalf, we can anticipate that kind of hostility. It may not wind up in you being beheaded, as it did with John the Baptist. But I tell you, statistically speaking, I think most of you know this, it's highly probable, virtually certain, that in the time I've been up here speaking to you in this Sunday school class, somebody in the world has paid for their faith with their life, probably several, you see. We're here, and we can thank God we're here in relative safety and comfort, but it ain't that way everywhere. And where people are faithfully representing the cause of Christ in this world, there are those who rise up in a rage against them that can be bloody and violent. We should be praying for our brothers and sisters in Christ, because that is what's happening, and there are resources available online and elsewhere that will tell you where these things are happening and how we can help in that great venture. Second, our part is to love and pray for our enemies. Paul says the weapons of our warfare are not flesh and blood. It's tempting. It's tempting to want to represent the cause of Christ with a machete and a machine gun, you know. We like to think about raw power. It's been tried in history, hasn't worked well. Charlemagne did put a sword to people's necks and say, now, tell me one more time, would you like to be baptized? It kind of reduces the options there, and a lot of people were baptized, but we don't know how sincere was their conversion. You know what I'm saying? And Paul, of course, I think calls us, as does Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, to a higher standard of not retaliating or using force to fight force, but realizing in the final analysis, God's part is to vindicate Christ and his people. Paul says, give place to wrath, vengeance is mine, I will repay. Some of you serving as Stephen ministers, elders, deacons, others, you have found yourself in the crosshairs of resistance, you know. And your part is to be as sweet as you can be, sincerely guided by the grace of God, believing that God is the one ultimately who brings about the vindication of his people. It's not up to us, it's up to him. A lot of people were nervous about Saul of Tarsus when he was heading toward Damascus. And then Saul of Tarsus ran into this lion. And the lion said, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting who? Me. When God's people confront some kind of resistance in this world, whether their name is John the Baptist or anybody in this room, Jesus takes that personally. Why are you persecuting me? And we can rely on the great truth that the God who has orchestrated history has also orchestrated your care and protection in whatever circumstance may come along. And on that occasion, of course, Saul of Tarsus became the Apostle Paul, because God is bigger than the resistance that may be mounted in this world. So John the Baptist, the meat of our sandwich this morning. Next week we'll move on to the feeding of the 5,000.